What do Caesar's last words, Black Tuesday, and Napoleon's defeat in Russia all have in common? The fact that they've all been muddied with absolute nonsense. All things considered, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is a pretty accurate depiction of the events surrounding the assassination of Rome's greatest general. Shakespeare used the Roman historians Plutarch and Suetonius as his primary sources for the broad strokes of the play's story, although he did take a few creative liberties along the way. The soothsayer who Caesar met never said, "Beware the Ides of March." Doesn't mean you shouldn't be careful around the 15th, but still. But maybe the most notable change can be found in the play's most iconic line.
Et tu, Brute!
According to Suetonius, some bystanders said that Caesar spoke the Greek phrase kai su teknon to Brutus during his assassination, which translates to, "You too, my child?" That said, both Suetonius and Plutarch agree that Caesar was probably too busy dying to come up with any meaningful final words. The point is, Caesar spoke in Greek. You know the tale. The famously deranged Roman Emperor Caligula was so deeply back-guano crazy that he made his horse a senator of Rome. And why not? It's a delightful story of royal madness and Roman decadence, one that's been kicked around so long that it feels true, even if it probably isn't. Probably. First off, the horse, Incitatus, was said to have been made not a senator but a consul, which is a totally different concentration, and actually more prestigious office. Second, even the least flattering accounts state Caligula only planned or threatened to elevate his beloved horse to the highest levels of government. Third, Caligula was probably kidding, zinging the Senate by suggesting that his horse was more competent than anyone in the Roman government. Still, it's probably worth mentioning that Incitatus did actually get plenty of special treatment. The horse enjoyed its own luxurious quarters, guards, and enslaved staff. Basically all the comforts you'd ever want with none of the responsibilities. Who'd ever say nay to that? On October 29, 1929, the American stock market crashed at an unprecedented rate. Billions of dollars of value were lost on a day that later became known as Black Tuesday. The collapse, together with increased unemployment and bank closures, led to the longest and deepest economic downturn in history, the Great Depression. There's a tiny bit of background to this. You see, the 1929 crash had been preceded by a decade of unsustainable market speculation, and as a result, many investors whose lives were tied up in bad investments suddenly found that all their money had gone kaput.
Everyone wants to sell. No one wants to buy.
One popular myth, which existed even at the time of the Depression, was the image of stockbrokers on Wall Street jumping to their deaths on the day of the crash. But the rates of death by self-harm didn't actually spike during October 1929, and those investors who did take their own lives generally didn't do it by falling out of windows. There's another weird side note to this. The market actually rallied a bit in late 1929 and into 1930. The real big dip happened around April 1930, and that really kicked off the Great Depression. The market remained below the 1929 highs until 1954. Yikes. Pretty much everyone knows what it's like to hate something so much that you want to burn it down and make sure it never comes back. So it's tempting to understand why, having finally defeated their bitter Carthaginian rivals, the Romans decided to salt the earth around Carthage so that nothing would ever grow there again. Sadly, for fans of dramatic overreactions, the Romans didn't actually do that, mostly because it would have been an incredibly silly thing to do. If you happen to know where Carthage is today, that's modern-day Tunisia, you might think nothing's going to grow there anyway. Well, it was different back then. You see, in the climate of antiquity, the area around Carthage was hugely productive and sat right on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. So Rome's true revenge against their enemies wasn't the salting of the earth, it was the shipping of food supplies out of the newly redeveloped city of Roman Carthage. They didn't salt them, they hosed them. Get it? The notion of salted earth seems to have been inspired by the practices of people further east, who would ritually sprinkle salt over a defeated city. This evocative image spread through 19th century texts that soon began to quote each other as sources, and thus a legend was born. So salting did happen, just not in Carthage. I was Anastasia. That's what Anna Anderson claimed in a mental ward in Berlin, Germany in the 1920s, and people bought it. It's easy to see why people might be attracted to the story of Anastasia Romanov escaping the execution of her family. It's got a thrilling escape, lost treasure, a beautiful grieving princess, and perhaps best of all, one fewer dead child in a world that was about to get very, very dark. After the execution, the Bolsheviks quietly disposed of the bodies of the Tsar, his wife, their 5 children, and their servants, and so it was easy for people to convince themselves that at least one of them might have escaped. Real-life imposters, yes, plural, Anna Anderson wasn't the only one, and sentimental films kept the idea of Anastasia's survival alive in the public consciousness, and people came to truly hope that the little princess had made it out alive. But she didn't. The bodies of the royal family were found in the 1970s, and at first it seemed like not enough remains were found to account for all 4 Grand Duchesses, sparking a burst of hope for those who believed. Then in 2007, 2 more sets of remains were uncovered. Even though the corpses of the young women cannot be definitively identified within the family, there are enough of them to prove that Anastasia died with the rest of her family. Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 is often remembered as the time France went to war against winter.
Of the 600,000 men you sent to Russia, only 40,000 have returned.
There's some truth in this idea, but it's kind of an oversimplicity of the Russian war strategy and tends to omit 2 climactic battles in the conflict. About 75 miles outside of Moscow, the Russian general Kutuzov stopped his retreat and turned to meet Napoleon in battle near a village called Borodino. Over 250,000 men fought during the battle. The Russians were eventually defeated, but they badly damaged the French army in the process. And while the French couldn't meaningfully reinforce themselves so deep into Russian territory, Kutuzov's army absolutely could. After the French took Moscow, they hoped to depart Russia through a warmer route to the south. Kutuzov had planned for this. In a bloody battle at the town of Maloyoroslavets, the Russians denied the French army access to the southern road, forcing them into a much tougher retreat back the way they came. After that, they continued to harass the French troops with attacks by irregular forces. So yes, winter may have indeed beaten the Grande Armée, but the fact is the Russians held it down for the killing blow. The Roman Empire wasn't doing all that well by the early 400s. Barbarians were on the attack across Europe, Rome was cycling through emperors at a fairly rapid rate, and shockingly, some of the empire's provinces had decided to try governing themselves for a change. As this crisis drew on, the Emperor Honorius supposedly made a fateful decision. The prosperous yet distant province of Britannia couldn't be defended anymore, and so it wouldn't be. But would an emperor really just yeet a province out of his empire? Probably not. The 5th century is a confusing period in Western European history, and the main source for this comes from a summary of a single set of imperial instructions sent by Honorius. There is some thought by classicists to suggest other interpretations of the text. In one, Britain is a mistranscription for an Italian name, maybe the region of Bruttium, which may make sense given that much of the document concerns the defense of Italian cities. Alternatively, the fateful phrase, "the cities of Britain must look to their own defense," may imply a continuation of sorts. The cities of Britain must look to their own defense until they get rid of the foreigners who are rampaging through Italy. In the end, though, none of this really matters, as whatever Honorius meant, the outcome was the same. Britain may not have been kicked out of the empire without a second thought, but Rome never recovered enough strength to re-establish control over its far-off island province. In 1066, Anglo-Saxon England came to an end with a mighty thwack. That thwack, of course, was an arrow hitting King Harold square in the eye during the Battle of Hastings, clearing the English throne for the Frenchish buttocks of William the Conqueror.
Now go away or I shall taunt you a second time!
Except not. The closest contemporary accounts of Harold's death are either left vague or describe him being hacked to pieces by several Norman warriors. That's a gory enough end, sure, but it obviously lacks the almost magical precision of an arrow going right through the king's eye. The story of the lucky shot only appears later in some far less reliable sources, and the famous image of a soldier taking an arrow to the eye in the Bayeux tapestry actually came from a later repair. Most of the arrows elsewhere on the tapestry were short medieval-style arrows, but this one is too long, matching the handful of other arrows added to the work by well-meaning but misinformed conservators. In fact, the original weapon here was probably a spear brandished by the figure in question, and there's been some disagreement about whether it's even supposed to be Harold in the first place. So, good for Harold. No arrow to the eye. He was just hacked to death. Okay, so in fairness, you can probably file this under not proven rather than not true. A 2003 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics showed that someone who lived in Mongolia roughly 1,000 years ago is the ancestor of 1 in every 200 people alive today. We know this because these people all share the same specific lineage of Y chromosome, and because that chromosome is even more commonly found in people who live in the lands once ruled by the Mongols. Circumstantial evidence points to Genghis Khan as living at more or less the right time and having the social and military power to impregnate many, many women during his life. His immediate descendants were often also wealthy, powerful, and violent, and so the telltale genes spread and spread and spread, like the one from the poem.
Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan had a harem of 7,000 women when Marco Polo visited him in China.
You didn't expect a Coleridge reference, did you? Anyway, this is how you end up with the idea that tens of millions of people today are descended from the first Khan of the Mongol Empire. It's a strong argument, but the information we'd need to prove it conclusively simply doesn't exist, as we don't have a genetic sample directly connected to Genghis Khan. Without a scrap of the Khan's own DNA, we can't rule out the possibility that this chromosome lineage didn't originate with a different, handsome, promiscuous, and fertile man. On top of that, Genghis, or whoever, isn't the only mysterious patriarch in history. Further studies have identified 10 more massive male line groups of related people descending from a common ancestor, and that includes England's King Edward III. Practically everyone with English heritage can trace a line back to the 14th century king. Mexican-born actress Lupe Velez deliberately cultivated a larger-than-life reputation, so it's hard to tell where the act ended and the real Velez began. Her dramatic personal life also overshadowed her talents, with her many rocky relationships with Hollywood stars delighting fans of Tinseltown gossip. Feisty is a word that's often thrown around talking about her. But whatever you want to say about Lupe Velez, one absolute truth we know is that she didn't drown in the toilet, as many people have since claimed. She was found dead in her bed, having died by self-harm at the age of 36. The toilet myth seems to date from Hollywood Babylon, a 1965 compilation of salacious stories and crime scene photos by Kenneth Anger. Whether this was a false rumor Anger heard or whether he simply made it up himself is unknown. From the 8th century until 1871, the Pope was not only the spiritual leader of the world's Catholics, but also a major political player. This is because the papacy came with the lordship of the Papal States, a meaty chunk of central Italy subject to the Pope's rule. As a legal fig leaf, the Pope's power over the Papal States was justified by the donation of Constantine, a document in which Rome's first Christian emperor supposedly suggested that popes should rule the physical realm as well as the spiritual. The donation of Constantine also argued that the Pope held supremacy over other earthly rulers, including the power to raise or dethrone kings. Unfortunately for the Church, the donation of Constantine was a forgery. Some people began to get suspicious as early as around 1000 AD, but it wasn't until the 1440s that a scholar named Lorenzo Valla proved it for good, highlighting the bad Latin, plagiarism, anachronisms, and other flaws in the document. It's now believed that the donation was written in the 8th century, many hundreds of years after Constantine's death. Valla's work seriously undermined the Church's credibility on the world stage, so of course they did everything they could to cover it up. They only formally acknowledged this not-so-ancient fraud in 1929. According to legend, the deposed King Edward II of England was killed in a dungeon at Berkeley Castle by having a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum. This story served a number of useful purposes for those who disliked Edward. It emphatically removed him from the political chessboard, mocked his homosexuality, and humiliated him so badly that we're still talking about his death today. Yet the story of the hot poker isn't present in the original accounts of Edward's death, which claim he died either due to grief or a more mundane murder, such as suffocation. The poker shows up more than 10 years later, and those later accounts don't all match up. For example, there's a fair bit of disagreement over whether it was hot or not. We should also keep in mind that the logistics of employing such a manner of death are challenging to say the least. It takes considerable physical effort by at least 2 men to hold the healthy middle-aged king and a third to deliver the fatal insertion.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the made-up bride of Paul Revere. The legendary image of Paul Revere blasting through the Massachusetts countryside and warning American colonials that the British were coming has its origins in an 1860 poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who greatly rearranged and simplified much of the real historical narrative of the night of April 18, 1775. For one thing, Paul Revere didn't receive the famous one-if by land, two-if by sea lantern signals, he sent them. He also wasn't a solo rider. He was just one part of a larger warning system, including Dr. Samuel Prescott, who actually warned the militia at Lexington and Concord after Revere was arrested outside Lexington. Oh, and he didn't shout, "The British are coming," either. The one quote we do have from him was his reply to someone telling him he was making too much noise. "Noise? You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out." Revere was important and a hero, but his deeds have been much exaggerated. So, why did Longfellow turn Paul Revere into his solo hero? Probably because "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Samuel Prescott" doesn't rhyme. There are 3 things every red-blooded American knows about George Washington. He was the first president of the United States. His face is on Mount Rushmore, and he had a gnarly set of wooden teeth. If you're a big shot who likes to impress people at parties with your boundless knowledge of American history, you probably also know the story of the cherry tree. It goes as follows. When Washington was a kid, he was given a hatchet as a gift by his father and promptly used it to chop away at a cherry tree. When Washington's dad confronted him about the tree, the little future president replied, "I cannot tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet." What a little rebel.
Oh, yeah, he said, I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my little hatchet. That boy loves to tell the truth all the time.
He does, sir.
However, as the Digital Encyclopedia of George Washington points out, that didn't happen. The story was introduced in the 5th edition of a biography of Washington from 1806 by an author named Mason Locke Weems, who wanted to tie Washington's political success to a life of virtue. The book was a bestseller, and now the story is everywhere. We all know the story of Ben Franklin and his kite.
You know I invented electricity.
I know.
Well, I'm sensing a little electricity right here.
Whoa, not so fast, Ben. The story goes that Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity by flying a kite with a key tied to it in a storm. According to tale, Franklin was shocked, quite literally, when he touched the key after his kite was struck by lightning. But as Mental Floss explains, the story definitely didn't happen that way, if it even happened at all. First of all, Franklin didn't discover electricity, he merely experimented with it. Most likely, the whole kite business was just an experiment Franklin devised to determine whether lightning was indeed electricity, an idea he proposed in a letter to a friend. When the letter was later published in France, French scientist Thomas-François Delabarre performed an experiment with a lightning rod proving Franklin's hypothesis correct. Whether or not Franklin subsequently flew a kite in a lightning storm is matter of some debate among historians. What's not up for debate, however, is the bit about him touching a charged key and getting a shock. Even a much less powerful charge than an actual lightning strike would have fried old Ben to a crisp. The story is pretty well known. Lady Godiva, the wife of Leofric, the Lord of Coventry, England, felt sympathy for the exorbitant tax burden placed on the peasantry of the medieval town. Leofric tells his pleading wife that he will lower taxes when she rides naked through the town, which she does. In a side element to that tale, as a sign of respect, all of the villagers stay indoors while she rides. However, one randy boy named Tom decides to take a look, getting struck blind and inspiring the phrase "peeping Tom" at the same time. As interesting as this story is, most of it is probably untrue. The story is based on a real person, a woman named Godiva, which is the Anglo-Saxon name that the Latin Godiva comes from, and she was the wife of Leofric, the real Count of Coventry. But as Harvard Magazine explains, historians of the time did not indicate there was anything notable about this woman, outside of being married to an important man. And you'd think that, oh yeah, there was that one time she and a horse streaked the town to lower taxes, would have at least garnered a mention. It wasn't until 2 centuries later that monks started recording this legend, likely as a way of explaining certain historical acts of generosity on the part of Leofric. Pretty much every kid in America learns on their first day of history class that America was discovered by the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus, who sailed the ocean blue in 1492 in an attempt to reach Asia and subsequently proved that the world was round.
I thought he directed Home Alone.
However, as the Washington Post notes, almost none of what we learned about Christopher Columbus as kids is true. For one thing, the ancient Greeks had already figured out that the world was round. Columbus simply thought it had to be smaller due to some bad math. He definitely didn't discover America either. Aside from the fact that there were millions of people already living there, Columbus wasn't even the first European to land in the Western Hemisphere. Leif Erikson is believed to have landed and made a settlement in North America 500 years prior. Last but not least, Columbus never set foot on continental North American soil, but only various islands in the Caribbean. If you feel like you've been lied to all your life, well, you kind of have. An enormous fire hit the city of Rome during the early days of its empire in 64 CE. The fire burned for 6 days and consumed 70% of the city, leaving about half the people without homes. Popular legend states that the Emperor Nero spent the time during the fire playing music and singing about Rome's destruction. Nero thought himself to be a visionary artist. So visionary, in fact, that his last words were allegedly, "What an artist dies in me." Dramatic much? The story gave rise to the popular expression, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, which has gone on to describe anyone who acts ineffectually during a time of crisis. However, this saying is rooted in lies. As historians have noted, the fiddle did not exist until about 1,000 years from the time of the fire. If Nero was playing anything at all, it would have been a cithara, an instrument similar to the lyre, whose name is the source of the guitar we know today. But wait, there's actually not any evidence that Nero was citharaing while Rome burned either. The closest report comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who says there were claims that Nero sang about the destruction of Troy during the fire, but even Tacitus found this story to be contrived. The cold hard truth is that Nero was still kind of a jerk about the fire, even if he didn't fiddle during it. He blamed the whole thing on the still obscure religious cult called Christians, and then built a big house for himself on the ruins. Like we said, dramatic. Why did the angry peasant class of the French Revolution cut off the head of their queen, Marie Antoinette? According to popular knowledge, it was because she said they should eat cake. Apparently, these folks didn't have a sweet tooth. The story goes that someone told the queen that the people of France had no bread, to which she responded,
"Let them eat cake."
The statement is pretty much exactly the kind of thing an out-of-touch, oblivious person would say.
It's just that she never actually said, "Let them eat cake."
However, as you've probably guessed by now, there's no historical evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said any such thing.
Well, that depends on who you ask.
Well, I asked Kirsten Dunst, who played her in the movie.
Encyclopedia Britannica explains that variations of that story, used to poke fun at rich people, had existed around the world in other languages for centuries before Marie Antoinette was even born. The first French-language occurrence appeared in print in a book by French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who attributes the quote to an anonymous princess. Marie Antoinette was a princess at the time, but too young for anyone to care about her culinary opinions. Rousseau-inspired revolutionaries likely applied her name to the story as a form of propaganda. The story goes that on All Hallows' Eve in 1517, an obscure monk named Martin Luther from the small German town of Wittenberg strolled up to the castle church and hammered to the door a list of his soon-to-be famous 95 Theses, which laid out grievances with the Catholic Church, primarily centered on the sale of indulgences, or in other words, the church exchanging forgiveness of sin for money. Martin Luther's bold and risky act subsequently kicked off the Protestant Reformation and would go on to change the world. So, what's the real story? Did this brassy monk stroll up to the church door, hammer in hand, and ring out revolution across the land? According to Martin Luther researchers, nah. For starters, the story was first written by someone who could not possibly have witnessed it, and it was first published after Luther died, who, by the way, had gone his whole life without mentioning the story to anyone. Additionally, Luther considered himself to be a good and loyal Catholic up until his dying breath, so it's extremely doubtful that he would have ever done anything to so dramatically provoke his superiors in the church hierarchy. Of course, Martin Luther did actually deliver his 95 Theses to church leaders, asking them to cease the sale of indulgences, but he was much more subtle about it, likely delivering a politely worded letter with the theses attached. But you've got to admit that the image of a man nailing his complaints to the door of a church is so striking that it puts the true, less exciting story to shame. It's easy to say, well, of course people believe these fake stories in Falcon times. They didn't even have Snopes to fact-check. But not all fake historical events happened, or didn't happen, in the distant past. There are major, world-shaking events reported in living memory that completely, actually, weirdly didn't happen. One such occurrence was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a confrontation between ships in the Gulf of Tonkin near North Vietnam that led to the U.S. becoming more directly involved in the Vietnam War. According to reports, an American destroyer was pursued and attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in 1964 on two separate occasions. The result of these reports was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized President Johnson to more or less go buck wild on Vietnam, which, as you likely know, turned into a national disaster. Well, it turns out we were all punked. As reported by the U.S. Naval Institute, declassified documents have revealed that the U.S. ship fired the first warning shots in the initial encounter, but failed to report said shots, which made the Vietnamese appear to be the aggressors. And the second incident? Yeah, it never even happened at all. Instead, U.S. ships motored around in a storm shooting torpedoes at tall waves, which could look like ships on a radar, for hours. It was initially reported as an attack to the higher-ups, but when they realized the mistake, they decided to go with it anyway. Great job, guys.
These days, real estate in Manhattan goes for over $1,700 a square foot, and that's pretty hard to fathom. It wasn't always that way, according to one of the most commonly repeated stories from America's colonial history. That's the tale that says the whole shebang was once sold by local Native American tribes to Dutch colonists for a mere $24 worth of beads. The point is an important one, and it's meant to illustrate what a historically bad deal the Native Americans got when they traded some trinkets in exchange for what is now some of the most valuable real estate in the world. But that's not exactly what happened, and the truth is a lot more complicated. For one thing, that $24 figure has not been adjusted for inflation since historians first reported it in the 19th century. These days, the total would be about $1,000. It's still not a fair price by any stretch, but not quite as low as the story goes. Additionally, the original deed of sale has been lost, so we don't even know exactly what goods were traded. We can get an idea from the deed of sale of Staten Island, though, which tells us that Native Americans got clothing, gunpowder, kettles, lead, axes, knives, and other tools that would have certainly been more useful than beads. Lastly, the natives most likely saw this sale as giving usage rights to the Dutch, not relinquishing the land wholesale. Unfortunately, even this modestly better bargain didn't work out great for them either. If you ever failed a test, especially a math test as a child, there's a chance some adult told you to cheer up because even Albert Einstein failed math as a kid. The lesson, supposedly, is that even though you don't know the difference between a trapezoid and a rhombus now, one day you could have literally some of the most important ideas of all time and revolutionize physics forever. That's a great tale to console the fragile ego of a child, only there's a problem. According to the Washington Post, it seems that young Einstein's legendarily poor elementary school performance has been somewhat overblown. He in fact got very good grades in school, even though he didn't approve of methods of teaching. By age 11, he was studying college physics texts, and at 13, he was talking about how much he loved Immanuel Kant. Unless you can boast the same, your F in math might just literally mean you're bad at math. Did Einstein fail anything, though? He did. He failed the entrance exam to Zurich Polytechnic the first time he took it, but you'll have to take into account he was still 16 and almost 2 years away from graduating high school. It turns out the only reason he failed was because the exam was in French, a language he had barely studied. And while he had trouble with the language and biology sections, there was one part he still aced. Yeah, it was math. Young Einstein definitely knew his trapezoids from his rhombuses. Rhombi? Rhombuses. Catherine the Great was a German princess who gained control of Russia by staging a coup against her own maniacal husband and making herself empress. Under her rule, Russia prospered to a degree unmatched by most rulers before or since. Catherine the Great was, in short, pretty boss. And yet, the only thing you probably know about her is that she died trying to do unspeakable things with a horse. How dare you? Well, more accurately, how dare generations of rumor spreaders going back to her own lifetime? Accusations that Catherine's insatiable sexual appetite was at the heart of her political success were incredibly common during her time, attempting to undercut her political ability as a woman by showing her to be some ungodly freak of nature. Such tales only grew upon her death, but here's the facts. Catherine the Great died of natural causes alone and with no horses in the vicinity. One morning in November 1796, she drank some coffee and sat down to write. 3 hours later, she was found on the floor having suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. Take that horse talk back to the barn where it belongs. You might not know the beginning of the story. The tyrant hero suspects that a golden crown he commissioned might not be pure gold due to the machinations of a greedy goldsmith, so he commands a local mathematician to prove the crown has been laced with silver. You probably know the rest, though. That mathematician Archimedes is pondering the problem when he sits down in the bath. The water rising around him causes him to realize that he can measure volume with water displacement, and then he runs naked through the streets of Syracuse shouting Eureka. This story has led to the word Eureka being a common expression for discovery and epiphany. It's even the state motto of California thanks to its long association with the gold rush. There is, of course, just one problem. Archimedes never said this. Well, okay, sure, yes, he probably said it at some point in his life. He just didn't do it in what was likely history's only math-inspired streaking session. As Scientific American points out, there is no record of this story until it's told by Archimedes' fanboy Vitruvius almost 200 years after it's supposed to have happened. But it's hard to keep down a good story about nudity and displacement. People just love nudity and displacement. The story of the Exodus is one of the central stories of Judaism, telling how the people of Israel were freed from slaves in Egypt by God, entering into a covenant with him, and ultimately leading to their arrival in the Promised Land. The story is spread out over the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, 4 of the 5 books of the Torah, the central scriptures of the Jewish faith. The story might be familiar to you, as it is foundational to much of Western culture. The Jewish people are held in slavery in Egypt. Moses utters a few famous lines,
"Let my people go."
There's some plagues, they walk across the sea, they wander in the desert, etc. At any rate, while it might be easy to dismiss the more magical aspects of the story, you might similarly conclude that, well, it's likely that the Jewish people were held in servitude in Egypt for a while and then escaped or were let go and wandered around looking for a place to settle. However, as Rabbi David Wolpe points out, there is precisely 0 archaeological evidence that the Israelites were ever in the Sinai Peninsula. Double, however, he also points out that the historical fact of the situation pales in the face of the emotional and spiritual truth the story provides people. Who founded Rome? Most school children could answer this question. It was Romulus, after whom Rome was named. He had a twin brother, Remus, and both were said to have been raised by a wolf who nursed them as babies. Their father, of course, was the god Mars, and Romulus himself became a god after he disappeared in a magical whirlwind to save him from the murderous jealousy of Roman senators, long after he killed his brother and set a pretty bad example for future Romans. As cool an origin story as that is, it's just not true. Historians agree that Romulus was almost certainly a completely legendary figure whose name was likely a back formation from the name Rome, not vice versa. And that's in spite of the New York Times coverage of the fringe beliefs of archaeologist Andrea Carandini, who has said that excavations uncovering signs of Roman settlement in the 8th century BC supposedly included a cave under the Palatine Hill that tradition says is where Romulus and Remus gobbled up wolf milk. Still, no dice. The overwhelming scholarly consensus is that there's no actual proof Rome's most famous wolf boys were a real thing. The image is an indelible one, indeed one of the best known in science history. A young Isaac Newton sits under an apple tree when suddenly an apple drops on his head, and presumably, as soon as he stops hollering at the tree, he has discovered gravity, thereby ensuring his place in history. But while the image has come to be considered the quintessential aha moment, things didn't happen exactly that way. Newton was forced to leave Cambridge University in 1665 thanks to a little bit of plague going around. He returned to his childhood home of Woolsthorpe Manor, and while wandering through its orchard, saw an apple fall from a tree and drop to the ground. This caused him to ponder why an apple, as well as other things like cats and plants and pumpkins and buckets of sand, always fall down and not up or sideways or whatever. And that's what led him to develop his theory of universal gravitation. Sure, yes, Benito Mussolini was a brutal Machiavellian dictator whose fascist regime had no underlying philosophy other than to use violence, deception, and terror to subjugate the people of Italy under the heel of its nationalist leader. But hey, at least he made the trains run on time, right? Nah, he didn't. As Snopes explains, fascist efficiency was a myth propagated by Mussolini and his followers, and a rumor spread by fascists to convince people that fascism was a system that was good for them and benefited them in concrete, everyday ways. The fact of the matter is that while the Italian rail system had in fact fallen into disrepair during World War I, most of the repairs and improvements that happened were done in the 1920s before Mussolini rose to power, though he was happy to take credit for them. That said, the trains didn't even run on time despite these non-Mussolini repairs. People who lived in Italy at the time have widely attested to the fact that Mussolini's far-famed railway punctuality was a bunch of baloney. Who was the first person to sail all the way around the world? Chances are good you said Ferdinand Magellan. Chances are also pretty decent that you may have just shrugged and said Christopher Columbus, though it's important to remember that he actually only made it halfway around and tried to convince everyone that he had made it the whole way by calling Haiti India. Points for optimism. But let's get back to Ferdinand Magellan. He's the guy that tends to get credit in history books and trivia flashcards for being the first person to circumnavigate the globe. There's a big footnote here, and Ferdinand Magellan was just almost the first to circumnavigate the globe. While Magellan did set out in 1519 and managed to lead his dudes across the Atlantic, through South America, and over most of the Pacific Ocean, he got killed by natives in the Philippines during a scuffle there. So while it's true that his ship made it back to Spain in 1522, Magellan was not there to cross the finish line. In fact, only 18 of Magellan's original crew of 260 men made it back home. If you want to get technical, it's probably better to give the credit to Juan Sebastian Elcano. who took over command after Magellan's death, though you could also make an argument for Magellan's Malay slave Enrique, who may have completed the journey in a piecemeal fashion before any European. It just goes to show, history really only applies to a certain sort of person.